14 iPhones, 2 months of preparation. This is it. A new or next to new version of every single iPhone flagship ever created. This is the most expensive and time-consuming video I've ever made, but it's gonna be amazing. So, before we jump into any kind of camera comparison, we're gonna start by unboxing all of them, starting with the original iPhone, and this is actually the only one where I didn't manage to get a brand new version of the phone. It was coming out at like £10,000 for the sake of just having a seal, but that said, this is next to new and still has all the stuff you'd get in the original package. And on that note, you can probably tell already, iPhone packages were much more elaborate back then. I feel like getting a smartphone in general was considered a much bigger deal, and so this thing is packed to the brim with stuff, including a pretty excessively sized charger that still delivers the same 5 watts of power of the newer, slimmer ones. You get a 30-pin cable, Apple's standard at the time, and what I thought was pretty cool, a full-on charging dock. We've also got the good old iPhone stereo headset here. Now, this iPhone is also known as the iPhone 2G. I really like the way it feels. It's just dense and solid. Okay, moving on, we've got the iPhone 3G. This was released a year after, and I remember this thing. If you had an iPhone 3G, I was 13 at the time, it was a dream. You could play touch hockey, you could pop virtual bubble wrap to your heart's content. Amazing. Don't want to damage it. To give you a bit of context, one of the biggest features of this phone was the fact that it had GPS in it. Yes, it was only 11 years ago, but this was a different era. Also, as the name suggested, this was the first iPhone to come with 3G functionality. And arguably even more important than this is when Apple debuted the App Store, which was super basic at launch, but was soon to change the entire smartphone landscape. We still got the same excessively sized charger as last time, and the cable and the earphones you get with this, they're the same too. And now for the surreal part, taking the seals off an 11-year-old brand new iPhone. Let me tell you, this video has been months in terms of planning and preparation, but moments like this make it worth it. Compared to the iPhone 2G that came before it, they switched that aluminium to just straight up plastic, which still feels solid, but it's just a bit less premium. Also, massive shout out to Invisible Shield for sponsoring this video, because it genuinely wouldn't have been possible without them. I love Apple packaging. Oh, look at it. So nice. Now for the iPhone 3GS, which is an almost identical looking phone on the outside, but is a completely rehauled device on the inside. We're talking faster CPU, GPU, it's got twice the RAM, although we are still only talking 256 megabytes compared to the 12 gigabytes of today's phones. You'll notice a lot of the seals on these phones, because they're so old, they weren't meant to be unboxed 10 years later, they have warped a little bit, and they look a bit crazy on the front, but they are genuinely sealed phones. You'll notice everything's gotten quite a bit smaller with this phone. Even so, I am loving the sounds of this crisp packaging. Got some newer Apple stickers. And Apple finally, with the 3GS, managed to compress that same 5 watts of power into a slimmer charger. Same cable, we're still on the 30-pin connector here, but the earphones have now been updated. On the 3GS and onwards, they come with a remote and microphone. The iPhone 3GS was like an everything upgrade. Speed, yes, but also battery life, camera quality, and new software. This thing shipped with iPhone OS 3.0, because yes, iOS was called iPhone OS back then. And that brings us on to the iPhone 4, which actually shipped with iOS 4. I'm going to say it straight up, I love the design of the iPhone 4. I think that the chamfers and the sort of sharper aesthetic is just better than the curves we had before, and the curves we get after. No. Okay. There you go. So you can see with this phone, they've actually raised it above the packaging. So let's put that to the side. We've got exactly the same 5-watt adapter. We're still on 30-pin as well in terms of the connection, and the same in-ear stereo headset. The iPhone 4 got people excited. It was a big redesign, but also was claimed to be at the time the slimmest smartphone in the world. And you can see these chamfers here, they're made with stainless steel because Steve Jobs himself insisted that compared to aluminium, which is a softer metal, he really liked how stainless steel aged over time. He said it gets beautiful when it wears, so that's the reason. That is so beautiful. I actually love this phone. Headphone jack. Oh, also, the new body of this phone just meant that they had to redesign the antennas, and a lot of people actually reported losing signal entirely on this. The iPhone 4S was an incredible phone, but launched at a time of terrible circumstances. So Steve Jobs was actually meant to do the keynote to this phone, as he did with every other iPhone launch, but he was too sick at the time. He was in hospital, and it turns out he passed away the next day. So in a sense, this was the last phone that he saw get announced. On the outside, the phone looks pretty much identical to the 4, but the S in 4S, it signifies the introduction of Siri, and this was game-changing. I remember when it came out, people were going crazy about it. It could only do basic tasks, but they loved it. It was people's kind of first glimpse at their own personal assistant. And again, same charging brick, same cable, same earphones, although this was about to change the year after. Also, in the years when Apple wasn't redesigning the body, it looks like they paid more attention to what was inside the phone, because with the 4S, the phone got a massive leap in camera and processing. Onto the iPhone 5, and this is one of the biggest changes that Apple made to their phone lineup. You'll see why in a second. I had to be super careful to knife everything from the side, so I didn't actually do what I have done before. I just straight up stabbed the boxes, because at this point, a lot of these are pretty rare. So the first thing is earpods. The iPhone 5 was the first time these were packaged inside the smartphone, and these were a massive improvement over the standard iPhone stereo headset. You still get the same charging adapter, but the other thing that's changed, and this is pretty major, is that the 30-pin connector has been shifted to Lightning. So that has changed 30 pins to just 8 pins, and the Lightning is also now reversible. Okay, so the phone itself, and since the passing of Steve Jobs, Apple switched back to aluminium from stainless steel, and this meant they could build a phone that was slimmer and lighter. And their direction has changed now, but at this time it was all about building the slimmest phone. You also notice the screen on the iPhone 5 is quite significantly taller than the one on the 4. I really like this as well, actually. It's really nice. The iPhone 5S was the first time Apple also introduced a cut-price smartphone alongside it, the 5C, but in this video we're focusing only on the flagships. Another big thing with the 5S was that this was the first iPhone to ship with iOS 7, and visually speaking this was one of the biggest overhauls Apple had had. Much cleaner, much flatter, a little bit more colourful as well. You're still getting earpods in the box, same plastic case, and still getting a 5-watt charger and still a Lightning cable. Following on from this idea of Apple introducing its bigger internal changes in the phones that don't change much externally, this one had a massive chip upgrade. The A7 chip inside this was the first 64-bit chip on a smartphone, which meant heavy computational tasks like recording slow-motion video were handled much better. It's also actually the first phone to have Touch ID, which is a fingerprint scanner built into the home button. And if we compare the back to the iPhone 5, you'll see that the 5S is the first time Apple has introduced dual LED flash. It's meant to give a more realistic exposure to people's faces. The iPhone 6 was the first time Apple also introduced a plus-sized version of their smartphone. Presumably they saw the success Samsung was having with their Note series and had to have a part of it. I do remember really liking the size of the iPhone 6. I was a Note user at the time, and so this felt refreshingly petite in a sense. It feels a bit like an iPod Touch in the hand. And this thing is full of big changes. Its cameras, its performance, its battery, and even its design. I never actually liked the iPhone 6 design. I think compared to some of their past phones, this is not Apple at its peak. But you probably already know there was a bigger problem, which I'll come to. This phone shipped with iOS 8, which was definitely a subtler upgrade than iOS 7, things like better predictive typing and better battery usage information. So, bendgate. The iPhone 6 is made almost entirely out of aluminium, the whole chassis, and it's relatively soft compared to some of their past phones, and so if you put pressure on certain parts of the chassis, it was known to bend. Also, yeah, I mean, it's not a bad looking phone by any stretch, but I just think its rounded corners, they're not as classy as some of Apple's past ones. So if we put that next to the iPhone 5S, it is so much slimmer. iPhone 6S, and as you can probably imagine, with this phone, Apple made it very clear that they'd strengthened the chassis. They probably tested that a billion times. The phone is thicker, and compared to the 6000 series aluminium used on the last phone, this uses newer 7000 series aluminium, and it could supposedly withstand about twice as much pressure before bending. Again, standard Apple box contents here, nothing new versus the 6. I feel like the iPhone 6S was not really a high point for Apple. The battery life was criticised, and the camera seen as not quite as good as some of its competitors. That said, this was when Apple introduced 3D Touch, and a lot of people like this, the idea that your screen could respond to multiple levels of pressure. The iPhone 7 was the first time Apple introduced a jet black color option, and it sold pretty well, although Apple actually issued a warning on its website saying that if you don't put a case on it, it's prone to suffering microabrasions. Still, of course, for the sake of this video, we had to get hold of one. Now, the main reason this video took entire months to film is that your best bet of finding potentially old phones that are still sealed is through pre-owned sites like eBay, but at the same time, you also get scammed a lot. A lot of the time, people will buy phones, they'll open them and then they'll resell seal them, and with this iPhone 7 it looks like that's what's happened. Anyways, inside the box, starting with the 7, the AirPods are now packaged differently and come with a lightning connector. So the body of this phone, it does look a lot like glass. It's actually not glass, the phone is still made of aluminium as before, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely the more premium feeling version. So the Plus version of the iPhone 7 is also the first time Apple introduced a dual camera system, but the standard smaller phone just has a single. But almost definitely the most controversial part of the iPhone 7 was that this was when Apple removed the headphone jack. And to compensate, they did include a headphone jack adapter in the box, but it felt early and it felt a bit surprising to a lot of people. Now, I really like the iPhone 8. This is back to glass on the front and the back of the phone, but this time Apple introduced wireless charging. I've never actually seen the black one in person, so this will be interesting. It's a seriously dense phone, but it feels good. We're still getting Apple stickers in the box as well, although these have changed over the generations. You can also see, compared to the 7, it generally looks pretty similar. I feel like the camera has become a little bit separated from the rest of the phone, but apart from that, the general positioning of everything has stayed the same. Now, the iPhone 8 was unusual for another reason. It was actually the first time Apple introduced 3 smartphones in one event. As well as the 8 and the 8 Plus, it was time for the 10. And this really felt like a pro phone. This felt like Apple throwing all its best technologies that it had been working on behind the scenes all at you at once. And the moment when they announced this was kind of amazing. They were at the launch event, they'd announced the iPhone 8 and the 8 Plus, and they did that classic move, one more thing, and it was the 10. It's still pretty much the same packaging, but they have just changed the layout internally. The most obvious change here was no home button. Apple had designed a gesture-based control system, and people basically had to relearn how to use iPhone. We've got a completely new 3D facial scanner on the front of the phone, and the iPhone X was the first time Apple used an OLED display in one of their phones. Traditional ones just used LCDs. It was also the most expensive iPhone ever, starting at $1,000. 2018, or last year to us, the iPhone XS, and to some people this was a more forgettable upgrade. It wasn't considered gigantic, but there were 2 primary things here. In a year when Android phones were coming out with pretty much bezel-less displays and pop-up cameras, this did feel like a bit of a conservative upgrade, but under the hood it was every bit as capable. Also, the XS is the first time Apple stopped providing the headphone jack adapter. I guess they're assuming that if you're buying a XS, then you're probably already on an iPhone 7 or later. The first thing is the A12 Bionic chip, a chip so powerful that even over a year after it came out, even now, it still outperforms a lot of top-tier Android phones. And the second thing is that this is the first time in quite a few years that Apple's camera sensor size actually increased, and they combine this with better software too. And that leaves us with the iPhone 11 Pro. And ever since the iPhone 7, where they introduced a separate Plus variant that had a dual camera versus the single, it feels like Apple's been leaning towards this notion of having a Pro phone and a standard phone. But the 11 is finally where Apple attaches those labels. To be completely honest, I wasn't that excited about the iPhone 11. I'd seen all the leaks, I'd seen all the renders for like 6 months prior, and it didn't really do it for me. But having used it, having seen it, having tested it, and compared it to other phones, it's pretty remarkable. In terms of both the battery and the camera, it is unarguably one of the best phones to date. They've reshuffled the internals of the box a little bit, but the most notable improvement here is the charger. Apple finally gives you a fast charger in the box. We've also got the same smart folding pins that we've seen on the Apple Watch charger. We've still got these same earpods, but the cable underneath has been changed too. Instead of the standard USB-A to Lightning, this is USB-C to Lightning. Alright, all phones unboxed, let's get into some testing. Now, as you can probably imagine, the process of setting up 14 iPhones was a very interesting one. I don't even think my room was ready for what was about to happen, so I spent about 3 hours rearranging and setting this up. I don't think I've seen this many cables in my room ever. Anyway, just before we get to the comparisons, here's the thing with Invisible Shield. They've just come out with the Glass Elite line of screen protectors, and they're probably the most advanced you've ever seen. You've got the standard Glass Elite, which has extreme shatter and scratch resistance. It's got reinforced edges and a new technology called ClearPrint, which disperses the oil that ends up on your screen to the point where it becomes invisible. I've applied this to our iPhone X. The anti-glare version builds on this further by adding in a matte layer that keeps direct light from reflecting on your screen, so we'll drop this on the iPhone XS. There's also a privacy version, which prevents anyone around you seeing what's on your screen, and probably my favorite, the Glass Elite Vision Guard Plus, which has all the benefits of Glass Elite, but with built-in antimicrobial properties that kill a whole load of nasty surface bacteria, plus a layer that filters out high-energy blue light to protect from digital eye strain. Also, the application process is watertight. I tested this 8 times on 8 phones, and I didn't get a single air bubble. So, it is time to test, and you can probably imagine yourself, the process of setting up 14 iPhones from all these different generations was an interesting one. I feel like I encountered every possible error on the way: not activating phones, phones not syncing with iTunes, phones not booting, phones' batteries dying, everything. It is pretty cool though that the iPhone that I had is running iOS 1.0. That's kind of rare, and it means a whole lot of things you would expect on a phone are just not here, including the App Store, but I was quite surprised to see that the OS still ran smoothly. Sadly, for the sake of making these comparisons, I did have to update it to iOS 3, and I also had to send a few phones back because of dead batteries, but finally we did get there. And so let's start by comparing unlocking. You might remember the video I made recently comparing every Samsung Galaxy smartphone, and whilst on those the unlock patterns changed dramatically, on the iPhones they haven't really. All the way up to the iPhone 5, it was just a case of swiping and then typing in a 4-digit PIN code. Unlike the Samsung Galaxy phones, the way everything looks on the iPhones really depends almost entirely on what version of iOS it's running, and so I've updated each phone onto the latest that it can reach. And so you'll notice on the 5S, which now runs iOS 12, Apple starts defaulting to 6-digit pins as opposed to 4 digits previously, and the point of that is to overcome something called brute forcing, which is where someone basically tries as many combinations as they can until they eventually guess it. The iPhone 6S from 2015 and onwards, those phones all have the option for iOS 13, the latest software. That's kind of amazing. Just before the speed comparison, I wanted to quickly show you how the App Store has evolved, and you can probably tell yourself, looking at the 2G and the 3G, it is old school. We're talking grey backgrounds, we're talking a dedicated section for the top 25 apps. Things have changed so much. On the iPhone 3GS, which was supported all the way up to iOS 6, you get a much more advanced App Store, with multiple rows that can be scrolled independently, plus a Genius section for recommendations. On the iPhone 4, you can see when Apple was testing a feature called Near Me, they wanted to show applications that were popular in your area, but that didn't really take off, and from the 5S and onwards, we're into the modern era. This is the current design for the App Store, and you could call it a magazine layout. It kind of brings attention to a few important apps and games, and then hides the others away, but in a way that can be searched for quite easily. Okay, time for a benchmark, and my weapon of choice is the Passmark performance test, primarily just because it's one of the few benchmarks that works even on older versions of iOS. It's not going to work on the iPhone 2G, because that's on iOS 3, which is super old, but it does work on the rest of them, and thankfully the iPhone 2G, in terms of its processing power, is nearly identical to the iPhone 3G, so we can use one score interchangeably. If we take a look then at CPU performance over time, it's kind of amazing. Between the 3G and the 3GS, the score is almost 4 times higher. Between the 4 and the 4S, it is a 3 times jump. Between the 5 and the 5S, almost 4.5 times. These are astronomical leaps in performance. After this point, there aren't any jumps that are as significant in terms of percentage gain, but between the 7 and 8, you're still getting almost twice the CPU power, which is a lot. The 10S was a pretty small increment over the 10, but the 11 Pro, actually a bigger jump than I was expecting. But the biggest jump comes when we compare where we are now to where it started, and on this benchmark at least, the score now is 1,000 times higher than the first iPhones. That's crazy. The next thing was a camera test, but just before that, while the phones are all out here, I thought I'd show you what the calculators look like on these phones. If you got there right at the beginning on iOS 1, it looks pretty circular, and after this it starts to become squarer, and as soon as we hit the iPhone 4 it stays square but starts to become flatter in terms of design, and on the 5S and beyond you've got the current aesthetic, which is circular again, but flat. Now, I'm going to do a display comparison as well, but it's time for cameras, and let me tell you, trying to carry 14 iPhones at the same time is a logistical problem. But we got there, and what I've done is captured 4 photos, but with each photo I've captured one version on every single iPhone, and so you can see the progress made as we go up the ranks. The improvement in the quality of shots is going to be most noticeable in low light, which I'll show you in a minute, but during the day there is one thing you'll notice. Dynamic range improves massively, the ability to capture detail in both the bright and the dark parts of the image, and I would say up until the iPhone 7, something is lacking, and this somewhat addresses the misconception that smartphones have plateaued, that they're not evolving, because actually a big part of this improvement has happened in the last few years. And for perspective, we're going to switch back to the iPhone 2G just to see how that compares. If we pull up a new image in a similar lighting condition, I'll cycle through it a bit faster, but you should notice the same trends. The shadows become better exposed, and the bright areas more well controlled, generally speaking. The iPhone XS is a notable turning point where dynamic range finally gets really good, even though that phone in most other senses was quite an iterative upgrade. And again, here is our comparison to the iPhone 2G at the beginning. But another thing worth noting is that the iPhone 11 Pro introduces an ultra-wide camera for the first time on an iPhone. Now for low light, I found a staircase that was pretty much unlit. It wasn't pitch black, I could still see with my eyes, but dark. And you'll see the first few iPhones pick up almost nothing, just a glimmer of light. And the interesting thing about this is that that trend barely changes. Even the iPhone 5S, the iPhone 6, the iPhone 6S, it's not until the iPhone 7 that we see a jump in low light performance. This again plateaus until the iPhone XS, which does a better job of dealing with noise and manages to produce low-light photos with more natural colors. But then, you can see the impact that night mode makes on the iPhone 11 Pro. And if we swing back to where we started, it is unbelievable to think that these two phones are shooting the exact same scene. The last camera test is front cameras, and right off the bat you probably noticed we started on iPhone 4, because every iPhone before that didn't have a front camera. You'll notice skin tones improving over time, as well as somewhat the exposure of the sky behind me. But again, this is another one of those cases where the big jump actually doesn't happen till the iPhone 8, and the even bigger jump, the iPhone XS. The 11 Pro makes slight adjustments to this and can also go much wider than every iPhone before it. So, for the display comparison, I wanted to transfer the same image onto every single iPhone. And this proved to be a bit of an adventure in itself, with the original iPhone not even having Bluetooth, not connecting to my Gmail, and refusing to acknowledge my laptop. But I did manage to do it. Anyways, displays, and starting with the original iPhone, we had 165 pixels per inch, or PPI, and this was considered pretty sharp at the time. This stayed constant with the 3G and the 3GS, but it wasn't until the iPhone 4 when we got a massive leap. This device was when Apple introduced the term Retina display. They still use it today, and it refers to the idea that the resolution is so high that the human eye can't even discern individual pixels. This stayed constant for the iPhone 4S, and funnily enough, for the iPhone 5 and beyond, the resolution density actually fell a tiny bit. Probably more noticeable though is the fact that these phones were the first time Apple used the standard 16:9 aspect ratio. The iPhone 6 saw a massive improvement in both display size and display quality, but Apple was still stuck using LCD panels compared to many of its competitors that used OLED, but that said, these were still some of the best displays on the market. And on that note, the iPhone 7 that came afterwards had a record contrast ratio for an LCD display. The iPhone 8 went down pretty well too, but at the time, most eyeballs were on what was launched alongside it, the iPhone X. They announced this at the same event, and it was the first iPhone to use an OLED display, and OLED is slimmer and lighter than traditional LCD, plus it can produce better colors, and is what allowed this nearly bezel-less form factor to be possible, and the pixel density also jumped massively here to 458. And over the next two generations, this display was refined. Better brightness, better contrast. The iPhone 11 Pro is something like 20% brighter at peak brightness than past versions. That's quite a lot. Again, huge thanks to Invisible Shield. And let me tell you, most times you'll see a sponsor, it's because a company has reached out to a YouTuber, but this was a case of me going to them because I actually do use Invisible Shield products on almost every phone I use, and I can stand by them. So links for that are going to be in the description. Anyways, this video has been a really long time in the works. If you enjoyed it, a sub would be massively appreciated, and with that being said, do let me know which line of smartphones you want to see next in the ultimate comparison series. If you haven't seen the Galaxy lineup, do check that out, I'll link that from here. And with that being said, my name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I will catch you in the next one.